Our walk started early that morning, not knowing what might be ahead. I think we were all praying against mudslides. Yesterday, the mudslide had been the big interruption, the rude surprise, the moment where your plan gets laughed at by geography. Today, the path returned, rocky, winding, sometimes narrow, sometimes open, and we moved into that rhythm again. Step, breath, step, breath. But something had shifted. It wasn't just that we'd gotten past an obstacle yesterday, the worst mudslide yet. It was that the obstacle had taught something, and not in a preachy way, in a lived way. You can't yank your way out of mud. You can't force your way through fear. You can't pretend you're not vulnerable and still travel honestly. And maybe, you can't become clean without admitting you're dirty. That thought came quietly, like a leaf falling onto water. I didn't say it out loud. Francis didn't need me to. He came walking beside me again later, hands folded behind his back like a man strolling through a garden instead of an ancient pilgrimage route. You did well yesterday, he said. I didn't fall. I was scooped up like a sack of potatoes. But you didn't cry, and you didn't melt down. That is one form of doing well. I smiled. He glanced ahead to where Teresa was speaking quietly with Aoife. Do you know a story about Teresa? He asked me. I lifted my brows. I know some. Why? He leaned closer slightly, like he was sharing a secret. Tell one. I laughed. You want me to tell a story about her? She's right there. She will not tell the funny ones, Francis said matter-of-factly. I glanced at Teresa. Teresa looked like the kind of woman who could absolutely handle funny stories about herself and still remain holy. So I raised my voice a little. Teresa! She turned. Can I tell them the horse story? For a second, Teresa's eyes narrowed like she was trying to decide whether this was a trick. Then she sighed, not annoyed, just resigned, and nodded once. Oh, Lucia said, immediately delighted. There's a horse story? There's always a horse story, Mom laughed. I adjusted my hands on my walker and said, Okay, so here's the one I read when I stayed in a hermitage with her name. She raised an eyebrow. It almost disappeared into her bandeau. I smiled at her, then turned to Lucia. Teresa was traveling, as she did, and at one point she was riding a horse and the saddle slipped. Teresa's mouth twitched. And it slipped so badly, I continued, that she ended up riding hanging upside down. Aoife's hand flew to her mouth. No. Yes, Teresa assured her. Liam laughed out loud, like, legs up? Like upside down, I said, making a vague gesture that conveyed indignity. Lucia's eyes were huge. What happened? I looked at Teresa, giving her the chance to take over. Teresa lifted her chin slightly. That's when I told the Lord the thing that you think is so funny, that if this is how he treats his friends, it's no wonder he has so few. The clearing erupted in laughter. I've loved you ever since reading that, I smiled at her. It made you seem human to me. I really needed that. I knew that, my dear. She touched my arm gently. That's why God put you in my hermitage. And I sat there with you while you made your decisions. I wiped a tear from my eye, thinking of that silent retreat, the one where I had to make very, very difficult life decisions. Thank you, I whispered. Even John of the Cross smiled, just a little, but it counted. Francis laughed like a man hearing one of his favorite songs. Dad chuckled. That's relatable. Mom wiped her eyes. That's going in my permanent mental file. I leaned toward my mom. See, saints had bad days too. Mom smiled. Oh, honey, they had worse days. And they still loved God, I said softly. Mom nodded, eyes warm. Yep. Then she added casually, That's why I can love him even when you're telling stories that make me picture Teresa upside down. I laughed. It suddenly occurred to me that Sean carrying me over his shoulder was a bit like Teresa riding a horse upside down. Speaking of upside down, did Alice Kay tell you her mom's on a bungee team? Silence. Confused, no, confounded silence. Mom lifted a hand. It's true. Lucia looked like she might faint. Wait, what? Mom smiled, completely unbothered. I was on a bungee team. Liam stared, like the thing where you jump off things? Mom nodded. Nope. On the California prayer walk, there were places that were difficult and even dangerous to walk across. The leaders put together a team of three of us, sometimes four, and we figured out a way to get across. He said we would do it even if we had to bungee jump. Sean looked offended. Why am I the one falling in mud and not her? Dad said dryly, because she plans her jumps. More laughter. Oh, tell us some of your stories, Lucia begged. Mom opened her mouth to start and then closed it. I'll tell you tomorrow, okay? And in the middle of all this, I realized something. Joy has a cleansing effect. Not shallow cheerfulness, not denial, but real laughter shared in safety. It's like soap for the soul. It removes the grime that hardship leaves behind. By the second rest stop, Claire finally lowered the little polecat to the ground. You may walk, she told her softly. The creature blinked, offended by gravity, and then, after a moment, began to move. Not away, not into the brush. She followed Claire. Claire shifted 3 steps to the left. The polecat shifted 3 steps to the left. Claire turned slightly. The polecat turned. Aoife gasped, She's following you. Sean squinted, like Mary's little lamb. Claire tried to look unaffected, but there was no hiding the gentleness in her eyes. Well, Mom said thoughtfully, if she's a lamb, she ought to have a proper name. Francis tilted his head. Agnes, he suggested quietly. Agnes? Lucia repeated. It means lamb, he said, and it was the name of Claire's sister, a strong and faithful woman. Claire's hand stilled just slightly over the creature's small head. Agnes, she said. The polecat looked up at her, indignant, suspicious, but undeniably present. Pearl snorted. Agnes it is, Liam declared, and Agnes, apparently satisfied that the world had at last arranged itself properly, resumed following Claire as though she had been doing so forever. A couple miles more, and we were tired. Not collapsing tired, but grateful tired. The sun was beginning to set, and we admired its beauty as we crested another mountain top. David called a stop for those who hadn't yet noticed the pile of packs. We'll rest here tonight, he said. Everyone who had carried their packs dropped them. We sat on rocks, drank water, took off our shoes, and rubbed our feet. The river, like all rivers, looked innocent, as if it had never harmed anyone in its life. Mom eyed it suspiciously. Is it going to attack us again? Frances smiled. Perhaps it will cleanse us. She nodded. It already did yesterday. And that's when we noticed it. Our hands, our legs, the hems of our clothes. Mud. The mud had not stayed politely behind us. It had traveled with us, splattered on boots, smeared on pant legs, dried in streaks. Even the walker wheels had mud in the grooves. I looked down and sighed. Okay, so we're back to soap. Lucia groaned. We just washed. Aoife said, We washed before Sean baptized himself in mud. Sean protested. That was an accident. Liam said, It was your destiny. John of the Cross, sitting on a rock like a carved statue, said quietly, We're not finished with dirt until we're finished with earth. That made everyone go silent for a second. Then Mom said, Okay, but that sounded like something you'd put on a mug. She nodded at me, knowing that I loved designing mugs. I suspected she wanted to give this one to her 4 faithful friends. Everyone laughed again. Apparently, Mom had decided her spiritual gift today was keeping us from turning every moment into a funeral. We separated again, men upstream, women downstream, and washed what we could. This time, it wasn't playful. It was practical. We scrubbed mud out of fabric. We rinsed gritty socks. We washed hands carefully because mud had a way of getting under nails and staying there like it belonged. And as I washed, I found myself thinking about how stubborn dirt is, how it clings, how it hides in seams, how you can't just wave water over it and call it clean. You have to work it. You have to press it. You have to admit it's there. And you have to be willing to look at the water afterward, cloudy, brown, carrying away what came off you, and accept that the filth had been real. Claire knelt beside me, washing a small strip of cloth. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, then said softly, "That dirt's kind of humbling." Claire's eyes flicked to me. "Yes. You can't pretend you're pristine when you're literally scrubbing mud out of your socks." She smiled faintly. "And yet we do." "Yeah," I admitted, "we do." Claire wrung out the cloth and laid it on a stone to dry. Then she said very simply, "That is why prayer is mercy." I looked at her. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She just continued washing like it was normal to drop life-altering sentences into a conversation about laundry. When we finished washing, the air had cooled, the shadows grew longer, the forest looked older in the slanting light. Trunks darkened, leaves turned more muted. Francis and David had already built a fire, and we moved toward it, wanting our hair to dry before darkness made it colder. Francis had shown David how to get a fire going quickly, because Francis can start a fire with what seems like pure goodwill. David moved away from the group and sat with his back against a tree, pack beside him, Bible tucked safely away. Dad helped gather wood. My mom who takes dangerous trails for fun, made tea like we were in a cozy cabin instead of sleeping in the woods. She produced something suspiciously like a small container of chocolate frosting. I stared at her. She stared back. "What?" she said. "Mom." "I didn't give it up," she repeated, as if that was the final word on theology. Dad sat down beside her, smiling. "You're going to be the reason they need confession by Wednesday." Joyce laughed. "The fact that they're Catholics is their problem. I'm not making anyone else eat it." Aoife leaned in. "Can I have a tiny bit?" Joyce's eyes gleamed. "Yes, of course." Lucia whispered to me, "This is the most human thing I've ever seen." I whispered back, "That's the point." As the fire settled into a steady crackle, Teresa and John sat with us, not above us, not like visiting celebrities, but like friends who had seen hard roads too. And gradually the stories came out. Not lectures, stories. Francis told one about a time he tried to repair something and made it worse. Everyone laughed because it was obvious Francis had always been that guy who genuinely tries and sometimes causes chaos. Mom told her story about crossing the train trestle across a cavern with the Bungee team, and the Amtrak train coming through right after they were across and had jumped off the track. "We barely heard it coming," she insisted. Claire told a brief story about the sisters at San Damiano, about how they learned to rejoice when small things went wrong because it reminded them they weren't in control. It wasn't preachy, it was just honest. John told something quieter, about darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, but the absence of comfort. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't milk it. He said it like someone stating the weather. And when he finished, no one rushed to fill the silence. Teresa, later, told a story about prayer that made Lucia cry quietly beside the fire. I watched Lucia wipe her cheek, embarrassed. Teresa didn't call attention to it. She just kept talking like it was normal for prayer to make you cry, like tears were part of the washing too. And then Sean, because Sean cannot tolerate solemnity for too long, said, "Can I just say something?" Everyone looked at him. He cleared his throat dramatically. "I would like to formally apologize to the mudslide." Liam burst out laughing. Sean continued, "Because it clearly wanted to be left alone, and I disturbed it." Mom said, "The mudslide does not forgive you." She and Sean had found a way to tease each other, which had become endearing. Francis said, "The mudslide has taught you." Sean nodded solemnly. "Yes, I've been humbled." Dad murmured straight-faced, "Good, stay that way." More laughter. Pearl lay near the fire, head on her paws, eyes half closed. Agnes, the polecat, lay in Claire's lap, now brave enough to rest without trembling. Every once in a while, Pearl's eyes would open and flick toward her, like she was checking that she hadn't escaped justice. And every once in a while, Agnes would open her eyes and stare right back, like she was checking that Pearl hadn't gotten too confident. I watched them and thought, Lord, this is ridiculous. And then, even more quietly, I thought, Lord, thank you. Because ridiculous is sometimes mercy. Sometimes it's the only way we don't drown in seriousness. Later, when the younger members of the group had drifted into sleep, I sat near the edge of the firelight in my walker, wrapped in a simple shawl against the cold. Dad sat nearby, staring into the coals. Francis sat across from us, hands folded, face turned slightly upward like he was listening to something beyond the trees. Teresa was quiet beside John, her posture relaxed, her eyes thoughtful. And Claire sat a little apart, with Agnes curled in her lap, her gaze lowered like she was praying without making a show of it. I didn't want to make the moment too big, so I said something small. It's funny, I murmured, how much time we've spent the last couple days washing. Dad nodded. We sure did. Mom, half asleep on the other side of the fire, mumbled, Soap should be a sacrament. I covered my mouth to keep from laughing too loudly. Francis looked amused. Perhaps not. Mom's sleepy voice replied, I said what I said. Teresa smiled. John's mouth twitched. Dad chuckled. And then Francis looked at me, not intensely, not dramatically, just with that gentle curiosity he always carries. What do you think the Lord washed today? He asked. I stared into the fire. I could have said our clothes. I could have said our bodies. I could have said Sean's boot. But I knew what he meant. I thought about the mudslide yesterday. I thought about my fear on that narrow trail and my fear today, worrying that there would be another mudslide. I thought about the way I'd wanted to yank myself out of vulnerability instead of letting myself be carried. I thought about how dirt clings and seams. And I said softly, maybe our illusions? Francis nodded once, satisfied. Dad's voice was low. That's a good answer. Claire, without looking up, said quietly, and our bitterness. That landed, not with drama, just with truth. Mom, bless her heart, broke the heaviness by whispering, and my chocolate frosting is still undefeated. I laughed so hard I almost cried. And in the firelight, with saints and ordinary people and a bulldog and a polecat and mud drying on boots, it felt like the road had fought back, and somehow we were cleaner for it.